On December the 8th, 2024, the Assad regime was toppled in Syria. This episode will really focus on what this means for Lebanon. You think that Jalani is actually not a puppet of America, Israel.
This is the conspiracy theory. America and Israel both didn't want the fall of Assad for a long period of time. Hezbollah underestimated Israel in terms of artificial intelligence.
But what now? What should Lebanon expect after the fall of Assad and the rise of a new leadership, with many questions still hanging over it?
Hi everyone, my name is Daisy Gideon and welcome to another episode of Real Talk. In this podcast, we uncover the uncharted realities of Lebanon and the Middle East by introducing you to real people with real stories to shift the narrative about this misjudged jewel and the reasons why this region remains so tumultuous. We hope you enjoy the podcast and are grateful to all those who support us through their generous donations. It is only due to your support and contributions that we're able to continue delivering these unexplored, real stories. So thank you. Now let's jump in. Welcome everyone to the 13th episode of Real Talk. And today we have a deep dive into the Syria Lebanon relations. I'll just give you a brief outline of the conversation that we're going to be having today with Ziad Majed. The historical aspect of the relationship will be the first segment of this conversation. We will then discuss the Taef agreement that ended the civil war in Lebanon and that impact on Lebanon. We'll move then into the fall of the Assad regime and the rise of Al Sharaa, the new leader of Syria. And finally, the fourth segment will look at the contemporary relations between Syria and Lebanon and break that down into specific subjects so that we give you a full and detailed conversation and deep dive into how this relationship between Syria and Lebanon is going to evolve potentially with this new dynamic set up in the region and between these two nations. So just to give you the introduction and provide you with greater context, let's look at it. What we know now today is that on December the 8th, 2024, the Assad regime was toppled in Syria after maintaining power for over 50 years. The opposition were a group of rebels led by a party named Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, who have since dissolved. The leader of the group, Ahmed Al Sharaa, has since become Syria's president, but this episode will really focus on what this means for Lebanon. You see, Lebanon has only two neighbours, Syria and Israel. Historically, both have attempted to colonise and exercise dominance over the country. During Lebanon's civil war, Syria occupied the country from 1976 until 2005. In 1989, after the Taef agreement that ended the war was signed, despite agreeing to withdraw from Lebanon over a 2-year period, Syria continued to occupy the country for a further 16 years, controlling Lebanon's internal and foreign affairs. During this period, they arrested many dissidents and stole funds from the country, stripped the country, and ordered the assassination of many high-profile nationalistic Lebanese figures, including the most high-profile, the former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, Gibran Twaini, and Samir Kassir, three extremely nationalistic figures. And finally, after the assassination of Rafiq Hariri in 2005, that was when Syria was finally expelled from the country. Now, Syrian intervention is not a new thing. Since Lebanon's independence in 1943, Syria has constantly meddled in the country, with some calling for the establishment of a greater Syria and others deeming Lebanon a necessary buffer between Syria and Israel. But what now? What should Lebanon expect after the fall of Assad and the rise of a new leadership, with many questions still hanging over it? Today, I am joined by Ziad Majed, a Lebanese-French political researcher and university professor specializing in Middle Eastern studies. He currently serves as the Elliott E. Burdett Professor of Middle Eastern Studies
at the American University of Paris. He holds a PhD in political science from the Sciences Po in Paris, a master's degree in Arab literature, and a BA in economics from the American University of Beirut. Majed has been actively engaged in research and advocacy related to political processes, civil society, and democratic reforms in Lebanon and the broader Arab region since 1994. His career includes roles with the International Red Cross, the Lebanese Red Cross, the Lebanese Centre for Policy Studies, and the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance in Stockholm. In 2004, he co-founded the Democratic Left Movement in Lebanon alongside notable figures such as Samir Kassir and Eli Khouri. This movement played a significant role in the independence uprising of March 2005, which opposed Syrian influence and political assassinations in Lebanon. Majed has authored several books and numerous articles in Arabic, French, and English. Notable works include Syria, the Orphan Revolution, and Inside the Mind of Bashar Al-Assad. So, there couldn't be a more qualified person to discuss this topic with than Mr. Ziad Majed. Welcome, Ziad.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me.
It's my pleasure, and we're very delighted to have you with us today. What I'd like to start with is what we set out, the historical relationship between Lebanon and Syria. And the question that we're going to be actually trying to answer in today's conversation is, what should Lebanon expect from this new Syrian leadership? Will they try to interfere in our affairs, or will they stick to their word and respect Lebanon's sovereignty? So where I'd like to start is looking at some historical context with a quote from Winston Churchill, who once said, "The farther backward you can look, the farther forward you are likely to see." So with this in mind, I'll pass it on to you and ask you, Ziad, to give us an idea of what you consider if you give us an idea of the overview of the Syrian-Lebanese relations pre-Taef, so the historical relations, just to give us a summary for our viewers and our audience.
Okay, thank you, Daisy. Well, I'm not going to maybe go that far in history to talk about the political culture that led to the rise of political elites in both entities even before their independence. But let's maybe start with 1943, which is a founding date when the two countries became independent after decades of a French mandate that followed the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, where the two territories were, of course, part of that empire. After 43, we have two states. After 1946, the French troops left, or this is the end of their military deployment. And maybe we do have two different political trajectories in those two countries, with Beirut and Damascus becoming at the same time rivals, good neighbors, with lots of malaise in a way, the relationship, because as you mentioned before, we are in a context of Arab nationalism. So in both countries, in both young states, you do have political movements and tendencies that consider all borders still artificial. They are the outcome of Sykes-Picot, that the French and the British divided the region. Israel is not yet created, but the Zionist project is imposing itself more and more with the British and Western support. So you do have in Beirut and Damascus questions about what kind of entities are we going to build? The borders, is it a greater Syria? Is it temporary before we talk or evoke Arab nationalism, an Arab project? And that will continue, but of course will be shaped, will be threatened by the creation of Israel. And in both countries, you have once again different reactions, but more and more it's clear that in Lebanon, I cannot say a consensus, but the agreement among Lebanese to protect a certain sovereignty and a certain experience that's being now in place is going to evolve towards Lebanese borders with Syria. And in Damascus, you have between national elites talking about Syria itself, Arab elites still within the framework of an Arab nation or those who consider Lebanon as the little brother or as an entity that should one day return to the motherland, to Syria. You do have different approaches, and we don't have diplomatic exchange or representations between Lebanon and Syria. Everything is managed through series of agreements, of accords, of gentlemen, if you want, agreements, until 1958, where you do have an important development, because in Syria and in Egypt, Nasser's Egypt, there is a project of unity. And in Lebanon, towards that project, you do have divisions between those who considered why not. It could be an interesting political experience. It responds as well to regional challenges, to the challenge of the Israeli occupation. While you have other people who feared that, considered that this will mean the end of the sovereignty in Lebanon, and opted for the Baghdad Pact, which was a counter alliance based in Baghdad, pro-American, pro-Western. So you did have all that. And then you have the rise of the Ba'ath Party in Syria, which is a game changer, because with the Ba'ath Party, and later, especially after 1970, with the Assad regime, the Assad clan in power, you do have more and more Syrian ambitions toward Lebanon, and you do have more and more Syrian projects toward the kind of annexing, at least politically, Lebanon, while in Lebanon you have more and more reactions to that, rejection of that, including among those who used to be Arab nationalists or very much connected and attached to the Palestinian cause. They saw in Assad a threat, and the PLO itself, the Palestinian Liberation Organization that was already based in Lebanon after Black September of Jordan, saw in Assad as well a threat. So when the civil war started in 1975 in Lebanon, it will lead immediately to a Syrian intervention as of 1976, pretending that this is to end with the war, while in fact it was Assad trying to control the Lebanese theater, the Lebanese scene, to use it, to instrumentalize it in order to negotiate with Israel and the United States, but also to negotiate its regional position. And that will continue after the Israeli invasion, the first one in 1978, and then the second one that was a devastating one in 1982. And all of that will continue through changing alliances, weakening one camp and then weakening the other. And the war continues until 1989, 1990, when we have the Taef agreement that stipulated the end of the Syrian military deployment in Lebanon, stipulated national reconciliation, political reforms, administrative reforms, a new phase in the Lebanese-Syrian relationship. But all of that will not be respected. Syria will consolidate its hegemony in Lebanon, in most of the country, based especially on its participation in the Gulf War, Desert Storm operation of 1991, in alliance with the United States and Saudi Arabia, will give Syria a credit, will give Assad kind of a green light in Lebanon to control, to pretend that he's going in a post-war, help the reconstruction, maintain the stability, while Israel continues to occupy in South Lebanon what it called the security zone, which is an occupied territory. Almost 12% of Lebanon will remain under Israeli occupation. And the pro-Syrian elite in Beirut will consider that as long as Israel occupies the country, well, we have to accept a Syrian presence in the country. And then we will talk about it once the occupation of Israel is over. Except that this occupation will be over in 2000, after years of Lebanese resistance against the Israeli occupation. But the Syrian regime will bring in other consideration to keep controlling Lebanon. And if you allow me, and very briefly, there will be a difference, a major difference between the Syrian control of Lebanon or the Syrian hegemony under Hafez al-Assad until 98, 2 years before his death, and then as of 98 under his son, Bashar, who will be prepared to become a president in a succession through training him in the Lebanese dossier. And until 98, Assad's father would be a kind of an architect of the political balance of power, interfering here, trying to calm down some tensions there, pretending that he's like the father, the godfather of Lebanon and Syria. With Bashar being now in charge of the Lebanese dossier after 98, the young man has no political experience, is extremely arrogant. He will immediately try imposing himself and his allies in all posts in Lebanon and in Syria so that he can have an elite supporting him in both countries. And I'm not saying that Hafez al-Assad, it's not a value judgment, was better than Bashar. Probably it's the opposite, or I'm not interested in who's better. Both were brutal dictators accused of crimes against humanity. But under Hafez al-Assad, politically speaking, there was a different way of engineering the Lebanese political scene. Under Bashar, it became much more into details, micro details, and that will build up finally, especially after the Israeli withdrawal of 2000 and the end of 22 years of Israeli crimes and occupation. Following that, in Lebanon, there is a new moment opposed more and more and mobilized more and more against the Syrian occupation or hegemony, leading to the confrontation, the assassination of Hariri, and then the uprising in Lebanon, plus the international pressure pushing Assad's son to leave the country. So we moved from a kind of political arrangement of two independences with nostalgia or with attachment to projects going beyond the borders into a direct Syrian control of Lebanon under Assad's father, into more control through details under Assad's son, and then a withdrawal with, of course, the legacy of all that, with the traces of all that, with the injuries of all that, because the Syrian regime did practice in Lebanon and did show in Lebanon the brutality that it showed as well inside Syria, especially in Tripoli, for instance, that what was dealt with as if it was a Syrian city in terms of violence, and the same mechanisms of the mukhabarat, the secret services, of the corrupt economy and its network will be as well used and deployed in Lebanon, with the contribution and the collaboration of many Lebanese political notables and figures until 2005.
Well, thank you very much for that comprehensive summary. I think what's important there is to be able to trace the journey from independence and the interference of Syria, but also the desire that there was a clear desire by the Syrians to take charge of Lebanon or have that greater influence over Lebanon, as we eventually saw. Now, I'd like to move to our second topic so we can dive into the post-Civil War intervention in Lebanon. We don't need to go into it too much because I think you've expressed quite a bit of it in the intros. So we look at Lebanon after the Civil War, the signing of the Taef Agreement. Syria is permitted to remain in Lebanon as the government began to build back up. But what was the expected withdrawal didn't happen over the 2 years of the Syrians, as you mentioned. They manipulated and used it to stay because they got the green light from America for Syria supporting them in the first Gulf War. So that was the trade-off. You know, it's those big empires, America, France, Britain, historically have always traded off smaller nations' interests to serve their own vested interests. So, however, we look at Syria, we look at the fact that it stayed in Lebanon and exercised extreme influence over the country. You expressed the many facets of influence, including and in particular corruption. It allowed for endemic corruption to spread throughout the country, and it needed it in a sense, because that way it could manipulate and control those political leaders across the country, from municipal leaders to parliamentary leaders, right across the nation. So we look at the assassination of Hariri. What I'd like to ask you is, can you describe, for us, briefly what this period looked like for Lebanon? I'll let you know what to go for.
In fact, after the Taef agreement, there will be a kind of a political crisis, permanent political crisis within the Lebanese institutions, because the Taef left some mechanisms related to conflict resolution when it comes to, political dynamics, left them very vague, which allowed Assad father to always play the role of the referee. Remember, we used to talk about a certain system called the Troika. The Troika meaning the President of the Republic, who's a Christian Maronite, the head of the parliament, who's a Muslim Shia, and the Prime Minister, who's a Muslim Sunni. The idea was that they should always agree on most decisions, and if there is a disagreement, then it might become a matter of sectarian tension between the representative of this community opposed to the representative of the other. And Assad used that regularly to appear as the referee, so they will go to Damascus, they will find a solution there. In fact, the solution will be dictated there, and then they will return and continue business as usual. So the idea was a control of the system through some vague notions in the Taef, without also applying what was positive in Taef, the question of, let's say, administrative decentralization, a new electoral system, how to overcome, how to deal with the sectarian question, how to create a Senate that will be sectarian to give guarantees to the different communities, but at the same time, to start liberating the parliament and other posts in the state from the sectarian quotas that finally weakened and fragilized citizenship, that fragilized the identity of the Lebanese as pushing them more into their communities and encouraging thus clientelism, nepotism, forms of corruption that evolved in parallel to the system itself that is a sectarian confessional system. So Assad played on all that on the one hand, on the fact that Israel continued to occupy South Lebanon to say that his army is there to guarantee a certain security. And then the alliances that were created during the civil war, especially the second phase of the civil war, the post-Israeli invasion, meaning after 82, most of the tenors of the political class in Lebanon were close allies of the Syrian regime, and they are now in most positions as well in the state. Some Christian groups are marginalized, and there is what was called the Christian ihbat or frustration, and also that was manipulated. Sometimes it was even on purpose. It was fed or encouraged in order to keep some political figures away, and in some cases there will be attempts at seducing them or bringing them to the state. So it was a way of controlling the system. At the same time, this is a period of reconstruction. Hariri, with his connections internationally, but also in the Arab Gulf countries, was capable of attracting investments, capitals in order to rebuild. There were lots of debates about the financial policies, the banking sector and its role. And of course, when you have reconstruction and you have money that are injected into the system, the possibilities of corruption when the state of law is fragile, when you have a Syrian hegemony, when you have warlords becoming politicians, all of that will also allow the Assad regime to benefit and to create a Syrian Lebanese network of corruption that will bring dollars and cash, but also projects to Syria. In the middle of all that, there is also another factor or another political actor that is Hezbollah. Hezbollah was created in the early 80s after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon through a cooperation between Iran and Syria. Iran was looking to export its revolution and was looking to obtain an access to the Mediterranean Sea. Lebanon is an ideal place for that. The Shia community has been traumatized by a series of Israeli aggressions and attacks in South Lebanon, being that most the population of South Lebanon is from the Shia community. Syria is in Lebanon. Syria needed Iran as well as an ally to contain the rival of Assad in the region, Saddam Hussein, who was at war with Iran. So between Iranian interests, Syrian interests, Hezbollah became like the product of that alliance. But also it has its own response to a Lebanese sociological situation, political situation. And Hezbollah evolved throughout the 80s and then the 90s, fighting the Israelis later in South Lebanon, after also clashes with the Lebanese left, etc. And Syria will be always saying to the West, to the international community, we are in Lebanon, we are in charge of managing the reconstruction on the one hand, and the stability inside the country, but also setting the limits for Hezbollah's resistance against Israel. You need a ceasefire in South Lebanon, you talk to Damascus. You need to deal with the reconstruction matters, you talk to Damascus. That is, of course, in cooperation with sometimes the US, sometimes France, sometimes Saudi Arabia. But with time, Hariri, who is the prime minister of Lebanon in charge of the reconstruction, will start feeling that he needs to have more margin of maneuver, that he can manage the Lebanese situation in a different way, especially after Bashar al-Assad became president. That's why I mentioned him in the first part. After 98, he's interfering in everything. He's trying to weaken Hariri and Jumblat as two heavyweights in Lebanon, exactly as he did in Syria with Saddam, with Shahabi, with others from his father's generation. And that is building up more and more towards a Lebanese Assad regime confrontation, because also after 2000, the whole pretext of the Syrian presence in Lebanon is over with the liberation of South Lebanon from the Israeli occupation. There is a Christian Kornet Shahwan camp that is calling for the end of the Syrian hegemony. The Druze and the Socialist Party of Walid Jumblat are joining that effort. Some secular groups are also, and reformist group are joining that camp. And the confrontation with the Syrian regime will start with the Kornet Shahwan, Minbar Demokrati, many groups that were at the time preparing for a post-Syrian hegemony in Lebanon, talking about the necessity now to rebuild the political institutions, to end with the impacts of the Israeli occupation, but also of the Syrian hegemony, and to start a new page in the Lebanese-Syrian relationships. Of course, Assad rejected that. He will start campaigning against Hariri and against the opponents of his hegemony in Lebanon, pretending that they are instrumentalized by foreign forces. And all of that leads to the assassination of Hariri, to the uprising that we call the independence uprising of March 2005. But also it will lead to a real division in the Lebanese society between Hezbollah and the allies of the Syrian regime on the one hand, and the group that was opposed to the Syrian regime. And then alliances will change, and all of that continue, of course, until the Syrian revolution in 2011.
And just touching on the Syrian revolution, because we see that that revolution really saw the, the disintegration or the limitations of the influence of the Syrian regime in Lebanon. So
yes.
How, just briefly, because I want to go into the third topic, but just if you can briefly summarize for us how that lessening of power in Lebanon by Syria demonstrated itself. What did we see? What happened? And because of the civil war, what did Syria have to do to protect itself? Because now it had an internal problem. Of course, we know externally there were figures outside of Syria that, supported the revolution within Syria and across the Arab region with the Arab Spring. But if you can just give us an idea of how that manifested in Lebanon.
Yeah. Now, when the Arab Revolution started, already Lebanon was divided within the same configuration between the pro-Hezbollah that is becoming more and more, in fact, the political power that is incarnating an attempt at hegemony. Hezbollah kept its weapon. It has a strong demography behind it. And you have the anti-Hezbollah, or those who are opposed to Hezbollah, but they were still trying to manage always compromises through what we know of the consociational system. So after 2006, there will be tensions, but then the Doha Agreement will create some new understandings or a new framework between the different political and sectarian groups. But all of that is not into the constitutionalization of the new political paradigm of the country. You still have tensions, and the system from time to time is paralyzed, because also under the Syrian regime, there was a new tendency of modifying the constitution each time there was an electoral event when it comes to the president of the republic. They did it for Ilyas Lehrawi, then they did it for Emil Lahoud, and then it became a kind of cyclic crisis. You have it as soon as there is a possible electoral event, or you do have talks about modifying the constitution or not respecting the delays and postponing the parliamentary elections, for instance, or we had years of vacuum when it comes to the presidency on many occasions. So there were also traces due to the Syrian hegemony within the system itself, in addition to tensions between Hezbollah and its rivals. The Syrian revolution started within the context of the Arab revolutions, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, with the different scenarios, successes, failures, foreign interventions, non-interventions. And the Syrian revolution will be confronted by extreme barbaric violence, torture. Now we're discovering more and more what the prison system was about, institutionalizing and industrializing torture and mass murder, using chemical weapon, barrel bombs. And then you have a series of foreign interventions, Russian intervention, Iranian intervention, through mobilizing militias from the region, Turkish intervention, American intervention when Daesh was created, or when Daesh projected itself from Iraq to Syria against it. You have as well Gulf monarchies being alerted by the Iran project in the region, so they also tried to interfere. And you do have lots of regional, international layers, in addition to the original national question that is ending with the Assad 50 years of dictatorship, or now we're talking about 54 years, but in 2011 it was still less, 41 year of dictatorship. So you do have all of that. And Hezbollah of Lebanon did intervene, sent troops and had a military intervention in Syria based on Iranian consideration, because for Iran, losing the Syrian ally would mean disconnecting Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon. There will be no more access to Lebanon to keep supporting Hezbollah and sending weapon and logistical support. And that's why Iran wanted to protect the Syrian regime and send troops from Iraq, militias from Iraq, but also from Hezbollah that is more disciplined, more trained, and saved, in a way, the Assad regime until 2015, when Russia had its military intervention after the Iranian one was not sufficient anymore to save Assad. Now, Hezbollah's intervention in Syria created also a new situation that is this time Lebanon being an actor in Syria rather than Syria remaining an actor in Lebanon as before. And that, of course, had many implications. Among them is the intensification or the acceleration of the refugee question, since we have in Lebanon now more than 1 million, maybe 1.5 million Syrian refugees. We don't have accurate figures about it. There are always exaggerations, myth, or in some cases, people who try to talk about less, something less than the reality of the thing. So you do have lots of discussions about that. But of course, Lebanese intervention through Hezbollah in Syria did create as well and did amplify the Syrian refugee question that is a true issue in Lebanon today and was an issue also in the previous years. And what I would like to add here that is maybe important is the fact that through this military intervention in Syria, there is a generation of Lebanese that had a war going on in or participating in a war that is going on in the neighboring country, that the other Lebanese did not maybe learn about their experiences there, what happened to them there. And personally, I do believe, and I did write it, that Hezbollah's 10 years in Syria or more fragilized the party when it comes to making it much more understandable to the Israeli services, in the sense that when Hezbollah is in Lebanon, it is within its social basis, within the geography that the party knows quite well. It has its security mechanisms, it's well covered and well closed party. While 10 years of deployment in Syria, where thousands of Lebanese fighters went there, they were in contact directly or indirectly with the Russian services, with the corrupt Syrian services, with many militias that were deployed in Syria and came to Syria. They were in a hostile environment because most Syrians were opposed to their intervention to save the regime that they revolted against. They were under the American radars because America became involved in Syria. And of course, under the Israeli radars, who not only the Israelis were active in spying and in monitoring what was happening, but they also started bombing Hezbollah there and the Iranian logistical lines of support of Hezbollah there. So Hezbollah fragilized itself. And the war that we just saw recently, in my opinion, the Syrian disaster played a role in weakening the party and in uncovering it to the Israeli services, in addition, of course, to the intelligence, to the artificial intelligence, and to the new tools of war that Hezbollah underestimated and Israel used. So I'm saying that because this is a very important phase for Lebanon when it comes to how Hezbollah will change during it, how the Lebanese society will be afraid of what's happening in Syria, but at the same time, you had different forms of expressing that. There was a solidarity, but also there were hostile talks about it. Hezbollah is there. Hundreds of thousands of refugees are in Lebanon. There is an economic crisis in Lebanon. And of course, with the second phase of Arab revolutions in Iraq, in Algeria, Sudan, there is an uprising in Lebanon in 2019. But between the financial collapse due to mismanagement, bad miscalculations, corruption, a series of factors, the port explosion, COVID, all of that will lead to the defeat of the Lebanese uprising, not a final defeat, because we still see today some of the implications of that movement of 2019. And of course, as Lebanon went into a different phase, but then the surprise came from Syria, since we did not, and most people did not expect that fall of the regime in December 2024. Many thought that we are in front of statu quo in Syria after the Russian intervention and then the end of large military operations in 2018. There was a kind of an agreement between Russia, Iran, and Turkey to manage the situation with less and less military attacks. And we went into this form of statu quo, but we forgot that in 2022, Russia withdrew its troops from Syria because of the Ukraine war. In 2023, Hezbollah withdrew from Syria because of the war in South Lebanon. And meanwhile, the Syrian regime that was counting on its allies, a corrupt regime, mainly working on drugs, on Captagon, on other forms of mafia-like economic networks, not capable of defending itself on the one hand, an opposition that is being managed, disciplined, trained, equipped, and supported by Turkey, especially around Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but also with a new generation of fighters who are looking to return to their villages and cities from which they were expelled a few years before in Aleppo, in Hama, in Homs, in the Ghouta, etc. All of that will lead to the 2024 developments. The regime collapsed and a new phase in Syria started with lots of challenges, lots of fears, and lots of hopes at the same time, like in any kind of crucial or historical development that we are witnessing now.
The depth of your knowledge and detail is fascinating. Honestly, there's so much to really take in. It's incredible.
Thank you.
Your expertise really shines.
Thank you.
I think it's a point that's missed on a lot of people that Russia withdrew in 2022 and Hezbollah, leaving Syria very vulnerable, obviously showing America and Israel that this is a time to eliminate.
No, I think they exposed themselves. They took lots of risks in Syria. In 2006, Israel underestimated Hezbollah, thought that it will bomb it and that will be over. When they went on the ground, they found ferocious resistance and they couldn't continue. This time, Hezbollah underestimated Israel on the one hand in terms of artificial intelligence, in terms of all the work that the Israelis did between 2006 and today in order to target Hezbollah. And Hezbollah underestimated the errors that it committed in Syria. Being there like that for 10, 11 years meant that all security services in the region and all spying agencies were trying to understand who's who, to rebuild the hierarchy, to know who knows who. And you know that they assassinated many figures through their, how do you call it, kind of a voice print.
Oh.
It's not
I
like
identified them through voice.
they identified them through voices, and when they speak, even if not on the phone, they can hear them with the drones and with everything that was, and that's how they gave orders to immediately attack here or kill there based on the voices. And they knew who's going to visit whom, which means that if they go there at the same time, it means, let's say, that Nasrallah is there, or that that person or that one is there. So they, through their voices and without talking on the phone, not to talk about the pagers, which is another Black Mirror story.
I'll jump straight back into our topic now, but the Israelis were definitely shocked, as you said, by their defeat in 2006, or they underestimated Hezbollah.
Yeah,
and I
they
think
changed everything after that.
They changed everything after that, and
they avoided. And Hezbollah was still waiting for them on the ground. They avoided incursions and they avoided direct confrontation. They bomb, destroy, annihilate, and then send commandos who will keep destroying and then withdraw. And whenever they stay a bit longer in a confrontation, they lose soldiers, so they withdraw. They changed their whole techniques, while Hezbollah did not. So the result is horrible. I'm from South Lebanon. I can see the devastation in many villages that can, like the northern part of Gaza.
Yeah. Let's jump into part 3, the fall of Assad and how Al Sharaa came to power. So after 50 years, we see Assad, Bashar Al-Assad, the Assad regime fall, as we said, on December the 8th, 2024. It was toppled in remarkably just a few days. This man, who was an ex-Al-Qaeda, imprisoned by American forces from 2006 to 2011, he founded after that was a founding member of Jabhat al-Nusra, or the Nusra Front. In 2017, the Nusra Front rebranded to become Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS as they designate it. And that organization was designated as a terrorist organization by America, European Union, and several other nations. But we're looking at the man who was also, involved as one of the leaders of ISIS, or one of the components, whether it's Al-Qaeda, Daesh, ISIS, but he was very close to the head of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And they have a history of being involved in several Islamist and extremist groups. He was the man responsible also for the attacks on Lebanon between 2014 and 2017. From my understanding, was involved directly in those attacks on the border with Lebanon, which resulted in the deaths of 5 Lebanese soldiers and the kidnapping of, I think, 14. They returned 9. So let's do a quick look at this guy and a quick look at HTS, and tell us what we're looking at, because it's divided. There are many who've come out from, George Galloway in Britain, who is so critical and condemns Al-Julani, who now is Al Sharaa, and the whole regime. And he's frightened, claiming it represents the new Taliban in our region. So what I'd love is for your input and your perspective on this new regime and what it means to the dynamics with Lebanon.
Yeah, I don't follow Mr. Galloway, who supported the Assad regime, so I can understand why he's saying that. But when it comes to Julani or Sharaa, I think there are many important factors, let's say, or events explaining the person, the transitional president today. Sharaa is first from a kind of an Arab nationalist family from southern Syria. His father is someone who worked and published on rentier economy, on oil, Arab political development, economic development. But the young man, in a rebellion maybe against his own family, got politicized during the Iraqi invasion of Iraq and went to Iraq, joining the jihad against the Americans in Iraq. At the time, there was no Daesh and no ISIS. It was Al-Qaeda of Iraq. And through the years of the Iraqi jihad, he was, as you mentioned, arrested by the Americans, put in jail for a while. But then in the Iraqi jihadist scene, there will be a division, an important one, between those who remained loyal to bin Laden, and then after the execution of bin Laden, to Zawahiri, who replaced him. That's one line. And another line will be a local line, loyal first to Zarqawi, who was a Jordanian actor of jihad based in Baghdad. He will be killed by the American, and there will be a succession when Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, it's not Abu Bakr, it's Abu Umar al-Baghdadi became the leader before Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi became the new leader of Al-Qaeda there. So Sharaa or Julani at the time will remain loyal to Zawahiri, to the leadership of Al-Qaeda, that has a serious political problem with the local leadership represented by Zarqawi, then by the two Baghdadi. Why? Because Zawahiri was always saying that do not declare a state first, and second, keep your military activities and your military attacks just against the Americans. Do not attack the Shia of Iraq. He's saying it for a kind of pragmatic reasons, because he was trying to look at the political scene in a different way. While on the ground in Iraq, Zarqawi and then the two Baghdadis did target the American troops, but targeted even more the Shia soldiers of the new Iraqi army or new Iraqi forces, and also Shia, civilians in specific events, ceremonies, etc. That division ended with the legitimacy of Al-Qaeda in Iraq by Zawahiri, and led to the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq, and then it will become في بلاد الرافدين, it was called Mesopotamia, and then it will be later, after 2013, it will be in Iraq and Sham, meaning in Iraq and Syria, with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Meanwhile, Julani left Iraq, returned to Syria, created al-Nusra, and remained loyal to Zawahiri and opposed to Baghdadi. And when Baghdadi declared the Islamic State, Julani was opposed to it and even clashed militarily in Deir Zur, in Raqqa, in many areas with the new formed Daesh. And he decided, after being labeled as terrorist by, as you mentioned, many Western countries, because he's connected to Al-Qaeda, he later, maybe he was convinced, maybe out of pragmatic reasons, maybe encouraged by the Turks, maybe by some people around him, he did a second rupture after abandoning the Iraqi jihad when it became under Zawahiri, under Baghdadi, opposed to Zawahiri. He will now make a second rupture, a second divorce with Al-Qaeda, with Zawahiri, and declare that he's not anymore interested in anything beyond the Syrian territory. And if you allow me, there is a clear distinction between a jihadist and what we call an Islamist. Julani is an Islamist. He considers that Islam is a source of legislation and of governance in a specific society. The jihadists they usually go beyond that. They consider that there is no territorial limit and there is no territoriality for their political agenda. There is no temporality for their political agenda. They can fight in any place, in any country, because they do not recognize the entities of those countries, wherever Islam for them is threatened or wherever they can promote Islam. So Julani was a jihadist, then became an Islamist, and today he's marketing himself, and many people believe that he's sincere about it. Others say that no, it's just a matter of public relations, that he understands the complexity of the Syrian society, that he cannot remain an Islamist as he was before, that he cannot, of course, remain a jihadist if he wants to be in the real arena of politics. And he is moving towards a transition in which he recognizes the complexity of the Syrian society, the diversity of the Syrian society, the fact not only that Syria has Christians and Alawites and Druze and Ismailis, and not only Muslim Sunnis, that it doesn't have only Arabs, but also Kurds and Cherkas and Turkmen, etc. In addition to that, he knows that even among the Sunni, there is no consensus about Islamism, that in Aleppo and Damascus and Homs and Hama and Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa and Dir'a, there are lots of political tendencies today after the revolution and the right of people to defend their positions and to try to defend the freedoms that they have also seized from the Assad regime, that between rural and urban centers, there are differences between the Bedouin or those that in Syria are considered semi-nomadic, or previously they were nomadic and then they settled in cities, and other people within cities. There are differences, there are social classes, there are tendencies. He cannot remain anyway as rigid as an Islamist could have been in a military context. For Lebanon, of course, there were fears during a period of time. There were clashes, as you mentioned, on the borders, but also, there were Lebanese fighting in Syria. So the whole situation was a messy situation, and the borders were not controlled. So today, one of the challenges is, in addition to observing what's happening in Syria and trying to rebuild Lebanese-Syrian relationships, to agree on new narratives, to think of what is the interest of Lebanon on the one hand, of Syria on the other, that both countries are challenged and threatened by an Israeli aggressive government and state as well, occupying more territories in Syria, refusing to withdraw from 5 strategic points in Lebanon, economic cooperation, border, etc. There is a new moment in which we're not invited to forget the past, because of course the past is part of us, part of our life, of our memory, and it has today implications. We can deal with all that, but to start a new relationship based on respecting sovereignty in the two countries.
So before we jump into the final section where we're going to look at today's issues, from what I hear from you is you think that Jelani or Al Sharaa is actually legit. He's not a puppet of America, Israel.
Definitely not. This is the conspiracy theory of America and Israel both didn't want the fall of Assad for a long period of time. Israel, in many pieces and articles and declarations, used to say that Assad is the devil, but he's the devil that we know, meaning that we prefer to deal with someone, we don't like him, but at least the Golan heights that were occupied by Israel in 1973 and continue to be under occupation. This is a front that was very calm. There was no military operations in it since 1974. Assad's father fought the Palestinians in Lebanon and oppressed the Palestinians in Syria for years and years. He was part of an American umbrella after the fall of the Soviet Union because he tried to normalize with the West and participated in the Gulf War. Obama was opposed to a regime change in Syria, kept saying we need a regime attitude change. Later Biden and in between Trump didn't do much to end with the Assad regime. Before the fall of the Assad regime, normalization was starting. There were Italian envoys in Syria and they reopened the embassy. There were more and more security services exchanged between the Americans and the Syrians when it comes to some jihadist questions, etc. So Assad has always played on one conspiracy theory, that is America and Israel are trying to destabilize me. That's one. A second one is the Gulf monarchies. Before he reconciled with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, he accused them of being behind the Syrian revolution, saying that they want to Islamize Syria. He also evoked Arab nationalism as being targeted in Syria. So all kinds of rhetorics were used, and even he approached the far right in Europe and the fascist groups in Europe, pretending that his fight is their fight against Islamism, and against all those who are threatening the secular order of Syria. And he received many delegations from the far right, from France, from Greece, from Italy. Fascist groups went expressing their support. Similarly to some segments of the international and Arab left that is either naive and doesn't know the situation in Syria, or prefer to avoid talking about the Syrian political sociology, about the jails, about assassinations, about corruption, about oppression, about all those statutes that we saw occupying all public spaces in Syria, and talk about borders and conspiracies and America. It's much easier, to explain the world through these kind of things. Now, did Al Sharaa, out of political pragmatism, try to send messages to the Europeans and the Americans that he's not a threat anymore? Yes, probably he's now into the official political arena. Was he supported by Turkey that wanted to modify the whole situation in Syria and to benefit from Russia's withdrawal and Hezbollah's weakening war? I mean, and the fact that it also had to withdraw its troops from Syria. Sure, Turkey also has its own interests in Syria. Can he now try to secure support from Saudi Arabia? He's doing that, and he's trying to do that, of course. But at the same time, we continue to see that America is very reluctant when it comes to ending sanctions in Syria and is not sending very positive messages to him. Israel, that never felt that the Syrian army under Assad was a threat and did not destroy it, did immediately react after the fall of Assad and attacked massively all Syrian army infrastructure in order to avoid the possibility of having the potential of a new Syrian army with new doctrine. They destroyed all stocks of weapons, of ammunitions, of missiles, of radars, airports, etc., and enlarged or progressed beyond the occupied Golan to occupy additional land. So reducing Jolani to this kind of configuration in the region would not be neither scientific, nor fair, nor correct. But is the region imposing itself on the Syrian scene? Yes, and there will be lots of challenges related to that. Is it imposing itself on Lebanon? Yes, and I think Lebanon and Syria, both of them will have to deal with a real challenge. Personally, I do believe that Donald Trump and his administration will put conditions on Lebanon and Syria when it comes to economic support, when it comes to recognizing the legitimacy, let's say, of Al Sharaa in Syria, or putting some pressure on Israel to withdraw from the 5 places that it kept in Lebanon. I think the condition would be normalize with Israel. Otherwise, the Israelis will not withdraw from South Lebanon, from those positions that they kept, and we will not remove all sanctions, and we will not invest in Syria. So there is a challenge, how to deal with that, how to reject that, but at the same time, to preserve our interests and not to be in a direct confrontation with America. The balance of power is not on our side. So how to say no to normalization with Israel before a certain solution is found for the Palestinian question, and how at the same time to preserve the balance of power and the interests of Syria and Lebanon. That will be a big issue. And the occupation, if you look at it strategically, Israel kept 5 positions in Lebanon, took over the whole Jabal al-Sheikh, right? The Syrian side.
Yes.
It continues around the Golan Heights to reach southern Syria. They are imposing through occupation something new, and we have to think of how to confront that, how to deal with that security and political risk and aggression, and of course violation of international law.
Yeah. There's never respected the sovereignty or international law. But it doesn't mean that our new leaders, we have placed a great deal of faith in the new leadership in Lebanon, that especially having a former president of the International Court of Justice as our prime minister, who knows how to apply international law, that might be able to defend Lebanon. But right now, I guess they're still getting their feet under the table and getting familiar with running the country and stabilizing things within the country.
But moving directly to Lebanon, and I know
Yes.
a lot of stuff has already been discussed that we were going to address, but let's look at some intricacies and the major issues. Let's just focus on the major issues between Lebanon and Syria now that we had the foreign minister who was supposed to be making a trip to Syria, Joe Rajah, was,
Yes.
I'm not sure if he's visited, but was supposed to be on his way to visit the new leadership in Syria and discuss relations, foreign relations. But there's so much to talk about between Lebanon and Syria. You mentioned the refugee crisis. I want to start with that because
Yes.
the other issues probably aren't as important for Lebanon as the refugee crisis. So as you mentioned, there's maybe 1.5 million, maybe 2.5 million refugees, Syrian refugees in Lebanon at one point during the height of the crisis and the war in Syria. Many hundreds of thousands have returned, in particular in the last month or so. People, are returning home,
Yes.
hoping for stability in Syria. We've had an incredible economic impact on Lebanon, with Lebanon having to, absorb those refugees economically, socially, housing. There's so much. Of course, many say that Lebanon was paid tremendous amounts of money by the international community to keep them here. But where is that dialogue? Where is that conversation? And where is that risk for Lebanon? Because there's a lot of Syrians who really prefer Lebanon to Syria. But what do you believe is that the key conversation between Lebanon and Syria regarding the refugees?
Yeah, well, there are many questions related to this very important issue. Of course, no one can deny that the refugee crisis in Lebanon is a real crisis because of the demographic dimension, because of the economic situation, because of the fact that many of the refugees cannot return to Syria soon due to the fact that their villages, cities are destroyed, devastated, etc. At the same time, we have no clear idea about the real figures because the UNHCR stopped counting refugees in 2015. Because in Lebanon, historically, there is always tendency to exaggerate figures, whether related to Lebanese local affairs or when it comes to refugees or foreign workers. Because also many Syrians left Lebanon to Turkey and from Turkey to Europe during those years, because some returned to Syria. But also at the same time, there were high birth rates in Lebanon as well among some categories of the Syrian refugees. So the figures are not clear, but definitely there is a huge number of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And proportionally, when it comes to the Lebanese population, it's probably the highest in the world refugee population versus national or local population. And in Lebanon, we have also the story and the history of the Palestinian refugees who have been here since 1949. So I do understand, and I don't underestimate the impact of the question of refugees on many Lebanese, and that is legitimate. What is not legitimate, in my opinion, is what happened from time to time in terms of measures against the refugees, not allowing them to circulate after a certain period of time, racist discourse, xenophobic discourse. I'm opposed to it, and I think it is not only unfair, it's not decent, and it's a violation of human rights and of the Lebanese constitution, and we can talk a lot about it. Now, what to do with this? Some Syrians will return gradually. More they feel that the situation in Syria is improving, they will be returning. There are negotiations that have started in Brussels and in Paris and in many places so that the international humanitarian and economic aid that was reaching Lebanon in some moments in order to support its management of the Syrian refugee crisis should now start encouraging the return to Syria gradually, and maybe creating in Syria itself possibilities for the refugees to return. But that will take time. So before we reach, I'm not going to say a full return, because also many Syrians found jobs in Lebanon, among the middle class or upper middle class educated Syrians. You mentioned that some might prefer to stay in Lebanon, or maybe to have the possibility at least to be between Lebanon and Syria. The right of return now is there.
Excuse me.
The right of return is there. how to deal with the return itself. It will
Yes.
take time. It should be organized. There should be international economic and humanitarian support of that, whether in Lebanon or in areas in Syria to which the refugees will start returning. And Lebanon should encourage that, should work on that, without at the same time, as some Lebanese sometimes say, we should put them in buses and send them back. This first will not work, cannot work. And second, this is not according to any legal framework or human rights framework. And simply it will create clashes and tensions that are not needed nor wished, etc. So there should be a work on that with the international community, with the new Syrian authorities, because the previous regime did not want most of the refugees to return. It did a kind of a cleansing, sectarian cleansing in Syria, and its supporters in many places in the West used to say that those will not return to Syria because anyway, there will be a burden on the reconstruction of Syria. Now the current regime wants them to return, but not now because security-wise, economic development, etc., they're not ready. So that will happen gradually, and we should keep an eye on it and encourage it and look for support to it legally and economically.
And talking about economics then, look at the economic relationships between the two countries. Just for context, we did some research and we found that, in 2023, Syria exported around $131 million in trade between Lebanon to Lebanon. The main products that Syria exported were glass bottles, cleaning products, tomatoes, and over the past 5 years, the exports of Syria to Lebanon increased at an annualized rate of 7.37%, from 91.6 million to 131 in 2023. Lebanon exported around 126 million to Syria, and the main products from Lebanon were bananas, corn, cars. But over the last 5 years, we've seen exports of Lebanon to Syria decrease at an annualized rate of 9.3%, from 205 million to 126 million. So I want to look at this sector. I want to look at the trade relations as well, but looking also at oil, because Syria obviously has a lot of oil, but because of the sanctions and the control of the Americans across those oil fields, had to reduce its production of oil and had no limited control over it. And I want to touch on the point that, there was, for quite a period during that control of the Americans over Syria, there were exports of oil from Lebanon into Syria, with trade being the Lebanese leaders and sectarian leaders and those in that corrupt class selling oil into Syria at a much higher rate that they can sell it into Lebanon, causing a supply and demand issue in Lebanon. Just give us an overview on those economic relations and dynamics.
I think when it comes to the economic relations, it's true that in recent years, due to the terrible economic crisis in Lebanon, all our export-import balance was not anymore as it should have been, and there are lots of questions to be that we need to ask about corruption, about the mafia in both countries, about many of the illegal trafficking that have been put in place for years and years. And I think this is one of the government's in Lebanon priorities, how to deal with the borders, not only in terms of the demarcation or how to set the borders, but also when it comes to illegal trafficking, when it comes to illegal economic activities. What is important in this moment today is that it's not only about Lebanon and Syria importing, exporting, or exchanging between the two countries. What is important is that now the opening of Syria and its borders, when it comes, if they will reconcile and normalize in a good manner with Iraq, towards Turkey, but also towards Jordan, and from Jordan to the Gulf monarchies, all of that will create lines through Syria that will benefit Lebanon economically. It can export through Turkey to other places. through Jordan to the Gulf. The movement with Iraq will also, with time, develop. It will benefit Syria because it will once again be the line Amman, Dir'a, Damascus, Beirut can be reorganized and reopened, or Damascus, Aleppo, and then Turkey. That's also an important line. Damascus, Deir ez-Zor, and then you go to Iraq. So Syria is important for Lebanon when the relations are in healthy and in good shape,
But
and
is
vice versa.
But is Lebanon important to Syria?
That will also need lots of. I don't think that now Lebanon is in good economic shape to develop for that, but these are the opportunities for the future. Also, reconstruction in Syria with reconstruction in Lebanon, if it's coordinated and if there is a framework of understanding, Lebanese ports can play a role in the reconstruction of Syria. Lebanese know-how or savoir-faire can play a role. But at the same time, if you do have projects of reconstruction in one area, in one region, with lots of international support, and you deal with corruption, you offer guarantees, you try to cooperate, there are opportunities, economically speaking. The question of oil, you mentioned the fact that in the eastern part of Syria, that is today the area where the American troops are deployed, but also where you have a Kurdish control. All of that will be negotiated first in Syria, how to share oil between the Kurdish forces and the central government within a framework of unification of Syria under a decentralized form of government or not, what oil will stay in its own area to develop the economic needs and to respond to economic needs in that area, what will be exported, how Lebanon can benefit when it comes to prices, since it's a short distance, what kind of touristic projects you can develop in both countries, and that is needed. And you know now tourism, if you have 2 or 3 states cooperating, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, that can create an important source of revenue and of attraction to tourists. So I think there will be lots of ideas. Maybe it's a bit early today because we are still more into the security concerns and the security challenges and what will happen to the sanctions on Syria. Will there be investments there? Will Sharaa be able to unify the whole country? He still have a serious challenge, that is the Kurdish one. He has a serious challenge to deal with the southern military divisions in Dir'a and in Suwaida and other places. They have in Syria the whole question of transitional justice that is important as well. And then we have the borders that we need to control and we need to manage, I mean, in a way that respect in reciprocity the sovereignty and the independence of both Lebanon and Syria.
And just going into the borders, and just something you mentioned very important, that opening up of an area, like a free trade area between the 3 nations or whatever agreements they decide, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, you know,
and
it's
Iraq
a dream.
maybe.
And Iraq, it's a dream. And for many, you know, having moved back to Lebanon 3 years ago and been studying it, looking into it, every Lebanese just wants to be left alone to fulfill their passion, their capability, their innovation. And I think it's like, I hear that now from the Palestinians. You know, you see these countries or these people who just want to be left alone in peace to fulfill express themselves. What are the dynamics in you know, the Israeli Zionist dynamics? Will they allow countries like Lebanon, Palestine, Syria just get on with living their lives and, you know, expressing themselves?
Yeah, we have now an opportunity, as you mentioned, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, maybe Turkey, one day reconciliation also and normalization with Iran. The region has huge potential economically, in terms of the human potential, in terms of the diasporas living outside, and many of the members of these diasporas would like at least to have the possibility of returning or of visiting, of investing. So there are lots of potential, human and economic potential. There might be as well cooperation, especially if you have decent governments and if you have with time stability, that is very important. And respect of diversity, of public freedoms, of private freedoms, there are lots of hopes. And I think it's very legitimate to hope and to consider that with reforms, with the opportunity that we have now in Lebanon with this government, with the opportunity of ending dictatorship in Syria, maybe things can move forward in the right direction. But there are also lots of difficulties and lots of threats and lots of challenges. They are internal, related to corruption, related to sectarian miscalculations, related to sometimes remaining prisoner of a specific history and of revenge and the absence of justice or the state of law that is and should be a priority. So there are internal challenges and, of course, economic challenges related to development, to social justice, to decreasing the gaps between those who own and those who lost or don't own, etc., all of that. And you have the Israeli threat. Those who deny that threat are similar to those who only consider that there is only one threat, that is Israel. I mean, there are on both sides those who negate and refuse to see the reality of things. We do have complexities in our societies and fragilities in our societies that we need to deal with, but we cannot ignore the Israeli threat, exactly as we cannot only talk about the Israeli threat and consider that everything else is perfect. So the Israeli threat today is about genociding the Palestinians in Gaza, and they are doing it, and they have done a large part of it, is about annexing the West Bank, or at least trying to annex as much as possible in the West Bank by modifying its demography. And it is about imposing on Lebanon and Syria a new reality in which the Lebanese and the Syrians, in order to get back what Israel took of their land and what Israel is trying to impose on their political agendas, the condition would be to recognize it and to be part of the Trump plan, or we don't know if he has a real plan, but at least this Trump approach to the Middle East, we will end the war. It means we will end with the Palestinians. Forget about the Palestinians, some reconstruction, I will put some money, I will force my allies and my friends in the region to put money, and you forget about international law, about Israeli war crimes, Israeli genocide, occupation, and the Palestinians will go to Egypt, Jordan, will stay where they are. So in other countries where there are refugees. So this is also a big threat. We need to think of it legally, diplomatically, in terms of our media discourse, in terms of our civil societies, how at the same time to know that we are dealing with a serious regional question that will not disappear. And at the same time, that question should not also, let's say, forbid or should not deviate our attention to other questions that are related to our economy, to our education, to our political culture, to building new political movements, new political rhetoric, to respect equality between man and woman, to seek social justice, to respect the environment, to deal with the so many things that also are challenges, and we need to meet them, we need to overcome them if we want to build strong states, strong societies, and to confront all external threat, especially the Israeli one.
I think that's a perfect point to end this conversation. I could keep going, but I know you've got to go, but it's been a fascinating discussion. We need to come back again and take topic by topic, because there is so much to discuss. But thank you very much for joining us today, Ziad. It's been a great pleasure, and I think we've all gained a great deal of knowledge from your expertise. Thank you.
Thank you, Daisy. This is very generous, and yes, hopefully we will have other opportunities to discuss the so many issues that we have on our menus in the region today.
We do. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Real Talk and experiencing firsthand the real stories told by real people. I hope you found value and meaning, and encourage you to subscribe to my YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts.
Your ongoing financial support is vital to our ability to continue delivering these stories, so please remember to click on the donate button in the description, giving only what you can afford. I spent my whole life giving my time, money and skill to serve human rights and social justice causes, and I know it's not easy to keep giving selflessly. But this work is important because the mainstream media has failed to live up to their obligations. So we need to step up, speak up, or we're no better than them. I believe by tuning in to this podcast, you are someone who wants to know the facts and the truth, so you can independently decide what to believe and what not to. My job is to deliver that information. Yours is to place a value on it. Whatever you decide is humbly welcome. Thanks again, and see you on the next episode of Real Talk.